Well, welcome. You've tuned in today to the fiscal year 2020 Maryland Heritage Area Authority Grants webinar. You may have also heard of our grants as referred to as MHAA grants. I'm recording this webinar in January 2019, and my name is Ines Barbary Smith, as shown here on the slide. I'm the Assistant Administrator for the MHAA program. And the whole goal of today's webinar is to tell you all who are watching out there a little bit about the MHAA program and about our grants, and see if a project that you're thinking of may be a good fit for our grant program, and if so, to encourage you to apply for one of the grants. More specifically, the things that we're going to go over in the webinar include the grant guidelines document that we publish every year. Then we're going to talk about what are heritage areas and what is MHAA. And we'll get into some specifics about the project grants. Who is eligible? What types of organizations? What types of projects do we fund? What will and won't be paid for in terms of eligible and ineligible expenses that you could include in your budget. And then we'll get into the grant application and award schedule, so you would know when exactly everything will be happening. And finally, we'll be talking about tips for completing the application and for grant writing in general a little bit. I should also say as we get started that if you would like a copy of these slides, please reach out to me. My contact information will be on the last slide, and we're happy to share a PDF copy of this presentation as well. First of all, I wanted to point out and draw your attention to, again, the fiscal year 2020 grant guidelines for MHAA. We've just put these up on our website in December. You can access them there. If you have any trouble finding them, we can send you a copy of the guidelines as well. This is basically your one-stop shop guide to applying to our program for one of these grants. This gives you all the information you need to know. It goes into many of the things I'm going to cover in today's webinar, and in some cases in greater detail, in some cases it's more summarized and I go into more detail in the webinar. But in any case, it's a great resource, and you need to have read the guidelines in order to apply for one of our grants. It's a requirement that you actually have to check off as part of the application that you have read through these. And it's very useful, as you can see from the appendices that we've listed there on the slide. The grant guidelines include things like a sample budget and a sample budget narrative. So you can see what we're looking for in terms of a budget, for example. That's just one example. We also have an applicant checklist that's at the very end of the guidelines, so that when you're going through the process and determining whether you've done everything you need to do, the checklist can be helpful. I would also encourage you to, in addition to using our checklist, go through the guidelines themselves and see if you need to add to that checklist. So make sure you get a copy of these and get familiar with them. Now, to move on to some background information about the Heritage Areas program. What are heritage areas? Well, this is some language that we like to use here with the Maryland Heritage Areas program to describe what our program is all about. Heritage areas support the economic well-being of Maryland's communities by preserving and celebrating the state's history, cultural traditions, and natural resources. So very wide-ranging types of resources that we support through partnerships that promote, support, and create place-based experiences for visitors and residents alike. So our program is all about connecting people, whether they're visitors or residents, connecting them to places in Maryland and to the stories that are there, the cultures that are there, the natural resources, place-based experiences. Another word we use almost interchangeably with that term is heritage tourism. Some more facts about heritage areas. They're locally designated, so they're proposed and conceptualized and envisioned at the county and municipality levels, and then they're certified by the state to be one of the state's heritage areas. Each of these areas and the program in general has a commitment to economic development through heritage-related tourism. So while we're supporting heritage-related tourism directly, what we're then creating is that economic development within each of these areas. And there are 13 different certified heritage areas across the state. You can see a map of them here on the slide. And as I move on to this next slide, you can see a larger map of the heritage areas. Looking at them, each one is different. You'll see that they take on different shapes depending on how they were conceptualized locally and then approved. So some of them are in one county, some of them are in multiple counties, some of them follow sort of a roads and nodes structure, following scenic byways, picking up important sites along the way. Others are big swaths of landscape, and so that depends on how it was envisioned. You do need to be located within the boundaries of one of these 13 heritage areas, or your project, I should say. Your project needs to be located within the boundaries of one of these heritage areas in order for you to be eligible to receive one of our project grants. But how do you tell if you are really in the boundaries of the heritage area? Well, we do have an online tool called Medusa that you can use. It's actually useful for a whole range of different research purposes. It's provided by the Maryland Historical Trust, and you can see the web address for it right at the top of the screen here. And my tools there. All right, yes, so there's the web address. Had to find my highlighter there on the side. And in order to do a search and figure out whether you're in a heritage area once you get to this website, what you need to do is click on the Layers tab that's over here on the side that I'm circling now in yellow. And under Layers, you'll want to check MHT, other MHT-based data. And then there's a sub-layer that you need to check called the Maryland Heritage Areas, of course. And if you look on this other side of the screen here, you'll see that this pink line work over these areas is showing that this is part of the Canal Place Heritage Area. And so you would put in your address up here at the top of the screen, make sure the Heritage Areas layer is turned on, and then you can zoom in and see specifically if the project that you want to do is located within one of the heritage areas. Now, if you have any trouble doing that, that's no problem. You should just contact myself or contact your local heritage area and talk to us. We can help and check and see if you're in the boundaries or not. The boundaries of the heritage areas, I should also say, are not set in stone. So if you find that you're not included within your local heritage area and you think that your site is important and you should be, please talk to your local heritage area, see if you would fit in with their themes and with their mission. And you may not be able to, you probably wouldn't be able to apply for a grant in this current round, but you could talk with them about a potential boundary amendment to get into the heritage area, if that's going to make sense in your case. More about the background of the MHAA program, but this also gets into your grant projects as well, because your grant projects need to be supporting the MHAA program goals. And those goals, those three main goals are developing heritage tourism product, building partnerships, and sustaining regional identity. I would say that many of the grant projects that we end up funding fall under this category, although they may relate to the other goals as well, because of developing heritage tourism product, creating experiences for visitors and for residents to connect with places. And those experiences could be archaeological, historic, cultural, natural, just connecting people with the heritage areas and the special places in them. And creating economic development through that as well. What is MHAA? Again, it stands for the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. And this authority is an independent state government entity staffed by the Maryland Historical Trust. So my colleague Jen Ruffner and I, she's the administrator of the program. I'm the assistant administrator. We both work for the Maryland Historical Trust, which is part of the Department of Planning here in Maryland. But we're working on behalf of MHAA, which is independent as a government entity. It's a 19-member body that meets quarterly and includes representatives from 9 different state agencies. So we have representatives, for example, from Department of Natural Resources, from Transportation, from Commerce and the Office of Tourism, Education, all these different experts coming together to work on this program, which again is wide-ranging in that it focuses on cultural resources as well as natural resources. And very importantly, the MHAA program receives up to $6 million annually from DNR's program Open Space, and that's from real estate transfer taxes here in Maryland. That's where program Open Space gets its money. And this allocation is never guaranteed. Each year we have to wait and see if it's going to be in the governor's budget, but we've been very supported by our state legislators and very, very glad to see that last year we did receive the full $6 million that the cap was raised to. Previously, we had only been able to receive $3 million, but because of advocacy work and demonstrating that the program is very important, we were able to get up to that $6 million mark, and we hope to be able to continue to get that level of funding for our grant program. One area where there's sometimes some confusion is the difference between what MHAA does and which grants we support and what the local heritage areas administer as well. So we wanted to add this slide in order to make that distinction. So today we're talking about project grants. These are larger grants that are up to $100,000. And MHAA at the state level provides and administers those project grants. So we're the ones who receive your reports when you're reporting on the project grants, etc. And we also provide the funds that are used for mini grants that are then administered at the local level. Then the 13 local heritage areas, they administer mini grants. So they're the ones in charge of the entire application for the mini grants, and they're the ones receiving your reports and fully administering those. Sometimes the mini grants are also referred to as seed grants, depending on your heritage area terminology. And the local heritage areas also provide assistance in completing your project grant application. So they've got a big role in the project grants as well, but the state level, we're the ones who end up administering those grants. And the local heritage areas also rank and score your project grants before they pass them on to the MHAA state review. And of course, the local heritage areas are also providing technical assistance to organizations and much, much more. Who is eligible for MHAA grants? So we already went over that you need to be included within the boundaries of one of the 13 certified heritage areas. You also need to be organized in a certain way. And so you need to either be a nonprofit, a local jurisdiction or a local government, a state agency, or a federal agency. So we do not give grants to businesses or individuals. And we support two main types of project grants. That's the capital grant, MHAA grants, and non-capital MHAA grants. Now, I want to make a distinction here and point out that MHT, the Maryland Historical Trust, also offers a capital grant program, and MHT also offers a non-capital grant program. Today, we're talking about the heritage area grants. So we're talking about MHAA capital and non-capital grants. Sometimes that can get confusing, especially on the website where you would access information about all those grant programs. So please keep that distinction in mind. MHT's grants, they've got a different set of eligibility criteria, review process, different timeline, different set of funding, all that. So back to the focus on the heritage area grants. What do we mean by capital versus non-capital? Well, our capital grants refer to our bricks and mortar projects. They refer to historic preservation projects, building rehabilitation, also the development of trails, as you see there in the photo. So trail construction, engineering drawings and architectural drawings, so pre-development and planning work for your capital projects. That would also fall into the capital range. We also fund acquisition. So if you want to buy a property, perhaps a historic property that would then you would then be turning into a tourist attraction, a cultural resource in your town. Another photo that's there in the capital grants collage is a photo of a wheelchair lift being installed and the ribbon being cut for that on the right hand or the far left hand side there. So accessibility projects, perhaps you want to do a capital project to make your historic building more accessible. All of these things fall under the capital project realm of MHAA grants. Turning to non-capital, these types of grants are pretty much everything else that we fund. They include exhibits, archaeological research that then has a heritage tourism component, interpretive signs, festivals, events, symposiums, websites and mobile apps that have interpretive content. So many, many different things fall into the non-capital realm. And both types of MHAA project grants, all of them ultimately need to be supporting the program goals and supporting heritage tourism experiences in some way. Another thing that I've included on this slide, because I want to make sure to say this early, is that all MHAA grants do require a dollar-for-dollar matching contribution from grantees. So that means for every dollar that you receive in grant funding for any of these projects, your organization is also required to spend another dollar on the project. If it's a $5,000 project, then your organization is required to spend the grant money and then spend the $5,000 in matching contributions as well. And we'll get much, much more into the specifics of that. But for now, capital projects, some more information specific to the capital projects for MHAA. These projects must meet a set of criteria called the Targeted Investment Criteria, which we will get to later in the presentation. And then we also have on this slide a list of some of the types of projects that I already went over that would be funded as a capital project by MHAA. Another thing to note is that if you're applying for if you were to receive an MHAA capital grant, you may be required to convey an easement to the Maryland Historical Trust on the property. We're going to get to that, some more specifics about that on the next slide. And all of your capital project grants that are funded through MHAA, because state money is being spent, they are all subject to compliance review at the state level. You may have heard of Section 106 review. This is the state version of that, to make sure that maybe you're constructing a new trail, but that you're not then also disturbing cultural resources, archaeology, for example, in the process. So that's just one example, and that's something that would take place after you received your award. Another important note about the MHAA capital projects is that you do not need to be applying for a project that's supporting a historic property. Your property doesn't have to be labeled historic in any way. You could be, in fact, constructing a new building, like a new visitor center. And for all of the capital projects, we do require, as part of the application, and you'll see this in the guidelines document, a property owner letter. So that's establishing site control, that you can actually do the project you want to do on the property, and establishing who owns the property that's in question. These grants are from $5,000 up to $100,000 in terms of how much your grant award could be. All right, so to get into the question of preservation easements, which probably will apply to a relatively small number of you out there, but it is important for you to understand this as part of this webinar. So first of all, what is a preservation easement? Well, it's a contractual agreement between the property owner and the Maryland Historical Trust, or MHT, that ensures that for the term of the easement, that the property owner will not develop the property, that they'll maintain the historic features, the historic fabric of the property, and that if the property owner does want to make changes to the property during the term of the easement, they would get those changes approved in advance by the MHT Easement Committee and ultimately by the director of MHT. Now, we're also pointing out on this slide that as of this year, MHAA will be requiring, or MHT, I should say, will be accepting term easements instead of perpetual easements. So if you conveyed an easement in the past that was perpetual, that's going to be forever and transfer with the ownership of the property to the next owner, that this new requirement will not apply to you. You've already got your easement in place. But for those of you who would be conveying a new easement, this will not be perpetual, it'll be a term easement. And this requirement only applies to MHAA capital grants on historic properties that are either listed on or eligible for listing in the Maryland Register. So even if your property falls into this category, maybe you are already listed on the Maryland Register, or you're eligible for listing there. Even if that's the case, MHT may or may not require an easement for your property. It will just depend on what the property is, what its significance is, and perhaps in their catalog of easements, they've already got your type of property covered, for example. The length of the term of your easement is going to be dependent on the amount of the grant that you get, and also on the duration of your grant project, how long it takes you to complete the grant. And you can see on page 16 of our FY 2020 MHAA grant guidelines, you can see all the details about how to calculate how long the term of your easement would likely be. The minimum term for an easement is 15 years, regardless of how much you get as your grant award. And additional grants would then mean that would result in additional years of easement term being added. So that's something important to keep in mind. If you have any questions and you're wondering, am I eligible for listing on the Maryland Register? Is this going to apply to me because I'm applying for one of the MHAA capital grants? Please contact us. We can try to help you navigate that for sure. Moving on to MHAA non-capital project grants. So I've listed here some examples of the types of non-capital projects that we've funded in the past and will continue to fund. These include planning, interpretation, an interpretive plan, for example, developing interpretive themes, events, exhibits, I mentioned festivals, brochures, technology, websites, archaeology, research such as oral history or architectural survey, and all research, again, needs to have a heritage tourism component and a public benefit component. Wayfinding signage is another example of something we fund. Educational heritage curriculum, for example, as well. One thing to point out about the types of events that we fund is that MHAA tends to not fund annual events that are just an annual event that's ongoing each year, but what MHAA does tend to fund is either a new event that's just getting started and needs to get off the ground, or perhaps an event that is being reinvigorated, reimagined, a new component of an event. But we don't typically fund, say, an annual festival that takes place and is very much the same each year. And these grants, the non-capital grants, are a little smaller. They are going to be from $5,000 to $50,000 in terms of your maximum grant award for a non-capital project grant. Something that we just instituted a few years ago, so this might be new if you haven't applied for a few years, and that's a minimum amount for your grant award of $5,000. So what this means is that when you're deciding whether or not to apply for the MHAA grant, you should think about, my project needs to be a $10,000 project total, because if I add the $5,000 grant plus the $5,000 contribution that's required from my organization to the project, then in total I'll be spending about $10,000 on the project. So if you are looking for a smaller grant, maybe check into one of the mini grants that are available from your local heritage area. Those are all non-capital. They only support non-capital projects. But if you're looking for a smaller non-capital project, check with them about that. And we just might not be the right source if you're not looking for at least a $10,000 project. So there are some things that MHAA grants just cannot support directly with grant funding. It's not in our regulations to do so. One of those things is overhead fees for the applicant organization. So don't put those in your budget for your project. Those are going to be things like utility bills and rent payments, mortgage payments. We can't support any kind of overhead for the organization. Another thing that MHAA grants cannot pay for directly is staff salaries for the applicant organization. However, you'll see some caveats under this point on the slide. So consultant fees are eligible for grant expenditures directly. So if you're bringing in an outside consultant, that's something the grant could go to. And staff salaries are eligible as part of the grantee's matching contribution or funds. And those are staff salaries of staff members who are working for the applicant organization, and specifically the matching contribution can include those staff members' time on the project. So not their time in general, but their time spent working on this grant project that's being supported. That can be part of the match. Now, the staff of partner organizations, their staff time can only count as in-kind match, not as cash match. The staff time spent on the project of the applicant organization's staff members, that can be cash match. Partner organization time, that's in-kind match. Another thing that's ineligible for MHAA grant funds to go directly to is project marketing, but we do encourage the grantees to include marketing and spreading the word about your project in your expenditures as part of your matching contribution. But the MHAA grant funds just can't go directly to that marketing. All right, so to get into some of the specifics that I promised about the grantee's required contribution or the grantee's matching contribution. So for all Maryland Heritage Area grants, they all require that 100% match, that dollar for dollar contribution from the grantee towards the project. And the match cannot be spent outside of the grant period, so it needs to be spent after the project start date, which for projects in the 2020 cycle will be in July 2019, and it needs to be spent before the project completion date, which will be set up as part of your grant agreement document. That match also cannot be spent on an unrelated project. The matching funds need to be spent on the project at hand that the grant is paying for as well. Now, 75% of your match is required to be cash match, and that's cash expenditures that your organization is actually paying to, contractors or to buy goods, that kind of thing. It's also, cash match can also include staff time spent working on the grant project for the applicant organization's staff, as we just went over. In-kind match, however, which can be up to 25% of the required match, that can include volunteer time spent on the project. It can include donated or discounted professional services and donated or discounted materials. So, for example, if you're working with a contractor who gives you a 10% discount because you're a nonprofit and that contractor is going to be doing part of the work on the grant project, then you would write that into your grant budget that you're going to be getting that discount, and the discount itself can be included as part of your match. As far as volunteer time, you can check the current volunteer rate online at Independent Sector is the organization that we use to check that volunteer rate. I think it's about $26 an hour. I'll check that for you. Okay, so as I was saying, you can check independentsector.org for the current volunteer time rate. And in Maryland, it's actually $27.50 right now. So that's the current rate that you can use to calculate how much your volunteer time is worth. Partner organizations' staff time for work on the grant project can also be included as part of your in-kind match. Another thing that we like to see included in your grant budget in general when you're applying is overmatch or other project costs. We include a column in our budget form to capture those other project costs, and what that means is basically anything your organization is spending that's above and beyond what's paid for by both the grant funding and your matching contribution. And it's important for us to capture that because we can understand that you understand how much the project is going to cost total. And it also helps us to make the argument that our grant program is leveraging a certain amount of money by seeing how much total is being spent on these projects that we're contributing to, and then we can make arguments about how much economic development the MHAA grants are indeed creating. Very importantly, at the very bottom of the slide is that other state funds are not permitted to be used as the grantee's matching contribution. So any other state sources of money, state employee staff time, grants that are coming from other state agencies and using state funds, all of that cannot be included as the grantee's matching contribution. However, if you're receiving funding from a private grant, from a local government grant, or county grant, from a federal organization, federal funding, again, a private donor or a private grant, any of those types of funding would be fine to use as part of your matching contribution, just not other state funds. As far as the timing of documenting the matching funds availability goes, you can receive a slightly higher score if you document your match, that you have it in hand, you have it ready, you're ready to go with that match prior to June 1st, 2019. Now, if you need some more time to get all of your matching contribution lined up, then that's okay too, but you do have to have it documented by October the 31st, 2019 in order to actually receive the grant. Now, awards will be made in July, so you'll know in July whether or not you would be receiving the grant, whether you got partial funding, whatever the case is, but then you've still got till October to get everything, October 31st to be exact as on the slide. You still got till then to get everything lined up and documented in terms of match. If you fail to document your match at that point, then we would cancel the grant and you would not receive it. And again, you can get that extra point if you have it all lined up before June 1st, 2019. What do I mean by document your match? Well, you need to submit as part of your application, or after you submit your application if you don't have it on hand at the time of submission. You need to submit documents that would include an award letter from a non-state grant, a letter of commitment from a donor of money, or a donor of services or staff time. That could be part of your documentation. Or it could be an approved budget from a non-state governmental agency documenting that the funds for your project are indeed budgeted in that government budget. It could include bank statements from your organization, just showing that you've got that cash in the bank. And if that's what you want to send us as documentation for match, that bank statement needs to be paired with a letter of commitment from the organization's leadership saying that what's in the bank would indeed be used as that matching contribution. Any questions about that, just let us know. We can help determine whether what the documentation that you do have lined up, whether that meets our requirements for documentation or not. And again, if you don't have these documents ready at the time when you hit submit on your full application, you can send them to us by email later, and we can add them as long as you send them by June the 1st. You'll be in good shape to get that extra point, and the drop dead deadline, again, would be October the 31st, 2019. Continuing to talk about timing here. We've made this slide about the grant schedule, so when can you expect which steps of the process to take place. The first thing that's very important to keep in mind, because it's coming up later this month, is that your intent to apply form will be due January 31st, 2019 by 11:59 p.m. This is an online form that's very short, that gives us just some very basic information about the type of project you're proposing, how much grant funding you think you would be asking for, and it allows us at the state level as well as the local heritage area to give you some feedback and tell you whether we think your project would be eligible, whether it seems like a strong project, how to make it stronger, that type of thing. That's a required step, and so that's what you need to be focused on first. Then your full application, which is much longer, will be due online as well. It's also an online form, again, much longer, and that will be due sometime between late February and early March. The exact date is actually set by the local heritage area director, so that's, if you have any doubt about that, you can talk to them. I've also got all the dates on the next slide so you can note when your deadline is there. Now, if you are applying for a multi-heritage area grant, that's a grant that's taking place across the boundaries of more than one heritage area, then you need to have your application submitted by February 22nd, 2019. We've got that deadline here on this slide. Once you submit your full application, we either may get back to you with questions or you may not hear anything from us. It's not necessarily a good sign or a bad sign. We just might not have any questions about your application. And then you will hear from us in July. July 11th is the decisional meeting in which the grant applications are going to be either approved or denied or approved with partial funding, put on a reserve list, whatever the case may be. You'll hear from us right around July the 11th, 2019. Then sometime in September through January, so we're giving ourselves a long range there of 2019 into 2020, that's when you would receive your grant agreement document in the mail if you were awarded a grant. And you wouldn't actually be seeing your first disbursement of a payment until, say, November 2019, maybe into spring, into April, March 2020. So as you're designing your project, please keep in mind that this is not a project that you'll be able to be getting our funding for directly after it's awarded. If it is in July, you would need to be spending your matching contribution up front, and you'd need to be thinking about the timeline for that project. Maybe you can spend all your match and spend funds and be reimbursed for the project. If that's the case, that's great. But just keep that in mind as you design your grant timeline. As promised, here is a list of all the deadlines for the full application that are set by the local heritage areas. They're all different because the local heritage areas review your projects first, and so they determine when they need to start that process on their end. So please note these. I'm sure you'll also find these readily available on the local heritage areas websites. They're also listed in the guidelines document as well. And I will note for the Heart of the Civil War heritage area that they have an optional draft deadline of February the 14th and followed by a deadline for your final application. So they'll give you feedback on that draft application if you are able to meet that first deadline. Very importantly, all of your projects, in order to be eligible for one of these MHAA grants, they must be consistent with the local heritage area's goals, objectives, strategies, actions. So they must be consistent basically with the local heritage area's mission. And for details on what that is, you can look at the local heritage area's management plan or subsequent planning documents like a 5-year plan or an annual plan available from your heritage area. And very importantly, talk to your heritage area staff at the local level. Figure out with them, based on the project that you're proposing, does it really meet the goals and themes and actions that they're interested in? And if it doesn't, maybe work with them to come up with a project sometime in the future that would benefit both your organization and the heritage area. And what do I mean by having a project that is consistent with the goals and objectives of your local heritage area? Well, it could take several forms. One thing is your project, not just your organization, your project itself that you're asking for funding for, it might be specifically identified in the planning documents. So it might be in their 5-year plan that they want to support your project. That's ideal. But if that's not the case, your project also might be linking with one of the themes that your local heritage area has developed. For example, the Montgomery County Heritage Area has a transportation theme, and the Trolley Museum restoring a trolley car in their heritage area would seem to support that transportation theme. Another example would be that your project might be creating a heritage tourism product that achieves a particular goal of your local heritage area. So, for example, the Lower Susquehanna Heritage Area has a goal of increasing water access, and the town of Perryville completing a public boat launch, that would then fulfill that goal of increasing water access set by the heritage area. And just in general, you want to be specific and make a strong argument for exactly why and how your project is supporting the local heritage area. As you're thinking about crafting your application and designing your project for this application process, one thing you're going to want to keep in mind is the review criteria. And we have that laid out very clearly for you in the project grant guidelines document. Check out pages 11 through 13, where we provide a sample scoring sheet of exactly what the scoring sheet at the state level will look like for fiscal year 2020. So take a look at that. It has an in-depth listing of the questions in each of these criteria categories, the questions that the reviewers will be asking themselves about your project. So I'd really encourage you to look at that. Remember that your project will be reviewed at both the local level and the state level. And as you look at that scoring sheet, you'll see that the broad categories of review criteria are as follows: project design, deliverables, and timeline. So is it clear what you're going to do, what the deliverables will be, that you have all the necessary steps and you've laid out a clear timeline for when those steps could be accomplished? The budget narrative, and budget documentation. So is it clear that you know and you've done research to support how much your project's going to cost, and you've been realistic about that? And you've given us detail to show exactly what those costs will be and how they'll be broken down. Urgency. So your project will be evaluated in terms of, does this project need to happen now? Either because it's a time-sensitive resource, so maybe it's endangered in some way, or urgency in terms of you're going to be connecting to partners who are all supporting a bicentennial, for example. So it's urgent time-wise in that way. Significance and MHAA program goals. So does your project support those program goals of creating heritage tourism experiences and partnerships and regional identity, as we talked about before? And is the property that you're working with, or the resources, are they significant to the heritage area? Impact. So your project will also be evaluated in terms of impact. Will it be protecting cultural resources, natural resources, for example? And will the impact of your project be substantive for your organization? How does it fit into your organization's overall plans and goals? Is your project highlighting the diverse history of Maryland? Is it highlighting the history and culture of groups who have been left out of the historical record over time or marginalized there? In terms of access and outreach, is your project going to benefit the public? Is it going to benefit a broad range of people? And how will you let people know about your project? So that's part of our criteria as well. Finally, expertise and qualifications. And you'll be asked to upload CVs and resumes for those who are involved in the project. So the reviewers will be looking at, do you have people with the right type of expertise involved to accomplish the project you've set out to accomplish? And please refer again to that sample scoring sheet in the project, in the guidelines, the grant guidelines for fiscal year 2020. I think that'll be really helpful for you to see. In addition to the criteria that's laid out in that sample scoring sheet, you'll also be scored at the local level, as we've discussed as part of this webinar. But you'll be scored at the local level additionally about consistency with those local goals and how you're fulfilling the local goals and strategies of the heritage area specifically. You will also be scored by some staff assigned points that are kind of a yes or no, plus or minus point. And so that you'll be scored in terms of your matching contribution, which we've already talked about. If you get us that matching contribution documentation early, by June the 1st, 2019, you'll get that additional point on your score sheet. In addition, each organization, if you do have a history of grants with MHAA or MHT, it's possible that you could lose a point or two based on your recent history of documented late reports. And we're talking about, over a month late, no request for an extension, or a recent breach of easement. So if you've had some of these issues with your previous grants with MHAA or MHT, just in the past 2 years, we're limiting it to the recent history with our grants. If you've had any of those scenarios with your organization, it's possible you could lose a point or two. If you have no history of grants with MHAA or MHT, that will not affect you because you won't get an extra point, but you also won't lose any points. We didn't want to be unfair to grantees who are applying for the first time. So you don't get a point for good history, you just would lose a point or two if you do have a history of not communicating with your grant monitor at MHAA or MHT. And the specifics of that are, again, in the grant guidelines. Now, the targeted investment criteria is another thing that the capital projects only will be scored on as part of your review at the state level. All right, so according to the targeted investment criteria, all MHAA capital projects must meet the two criteria that we have listed at the top of the slide here. They all must meet that the project contributes to fulfilling the priorities in the Certified Heritage Area Management Plan, 5-year plan, or annual work plan. So same thing we've been talking about before, you need to be supporting your local heritage area in whatever your project is. The project also must leverage private or public investment in heritage tourism resources and facilitate economic development. So most capital grants, this is one that they tend to meet because you are leveraging, matching contributions, and you're creating a lasting and sustainable resource with your capital project. So all MHAA capital projects must meet those two criteria. Now you have an opportunity to receive an extra point if your capital project meets 2 of the additional criteria. All the capital projects need to meet at least one of these additional criteria listed as 1 through 4 here on the slide. But if you meet 2 of them, again, you'll get that additional point on your scoring sheet. And MHAA staff will be the ones who are determining this, this point as part of the staff assigned points. If you have any questions about those, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Jen Ruffner, and we can talk with you and make sure you think your project will indeed meet the minimum criteria, and see if it meets some of those additional criteria as well. All right, so to move on to some of the more general grant writing tips that we have for you in this process, one of those general tips is just don't wait till the last minute. Everything will seem more stressful if you're waiting till those last few days to submit your full application for this grant. And indeed, because of all the documents that you need to gather and all the different steps of the application process for MHAA, I think it would be very difficult to complete this application process if you're giving yourself just a couple days. Please go ahead and start the process, dig into those grant guidelines, look at the checklist, and start checking things off as you go along. Start prioritizing. Of course, ask us questions if you're not sure. That's one thing we want to emphasize and that I want to make you aware of as a big part of this webinar is that we are here, the staff members at both the local heritage area level and the state level, we're here to answer your questions and help you in this process. And don't create, a new project that your organization is not invested in, that's not an important part of your organization's mission, just because the project would fit our grant guidelines. No, let the project be your guide to whether you should apply or not. Does the project you're already thinking of, does it seem like a good fit after you've gone through this process and read the guidelines? And part of the reason I say that, as it says on the slide, is that these grants take a lot of work. They take a lot of resources from staff or volunteers and a lot of time. And so if you're applying for one, that just in order to show that you're getting more grant funding, that's not going to be helpful for your organization's big picture. Before you even start to write your grant application, you should be asking yourself these questions and asking your organization these questions to make sure that you have the project fully conceptualized in your mind. So why are we doing the project? What's the timeline? Is there flexibility in the timeline to allow for actually receiving the grant funds? Or could we be reimbursed for those grant funds because we have money on hand? How does the project fit into your organization's big picture? So how does it support your organization's goals, not just MHAA's goals? What are the steps that you need to take to finish the project? And that'll be important in creating your timeline. Who will undertake the work? And think about, do they have the expertise that's needed? Do we need to bring in outside experts? And envisioning, what would success look like? What is the desired outcome of this project? So you need to have all that clear in your mind and clear in your organization's understanding before you start writing your grant application. Oh, excuse me there, because you have zoomed in on the slide there. Okay, technical difficulties. So some more grant writing tips. You want to make sure to check your spelling, check your grammar, check your math. Well, we are all human and we all make errors, but please make sure to check those. We do have a spelling check for many of the text entry boxes in the application. Don't use all caps as a means of emphasis. It just looks like you're yelling at us, and the reviewers have said that it makes it harder to read your application if you're using all capital letters. Very importantly, I think this is probably the best piece of advice we can give, is to have someone who's unfamiliar with your project actually read your application, because you, the writer of the application, are so entrenched in the project. You already have this great understanding of the project And if you have someone who is coming in completely fresh with new eyes, they will be able to give you great advice and point out places where you're not being clear. And multiple people, if you have multiple people who are unfamiliar with the project to read your application, that's even better. Give your project a descriptive name, one that's different from your previous grants, so you don't want to be submitting the same grant application every year. That is museum programming, for example, and it'll be hard for the reviewers and the staff to remember, oh, this is a different application. Show us in the title what's unique about the project you're proposing in this grant round. And of course, it's always a balancing act to provide as much detail as requested, but within the word limits. So remember, reviewers who are reading your project would like you to be concise, to explain exactly what you're going to do, but you don't have to be flowery and use 5 paragraphs to explain something you could explain in 1 paragraph. So just provide details, but within the word limits. Again, I know that's hard, it just takes practice. And if possible, make sure that your match is strong and in hand or committed. And if you do have that match committed by June the 1st, you're eligible for that additional point on your application. One thing that you can do to make your application stronger is to actually print out your project description or your deliverables and timetable along with your budget and your budget narrative, and try to make sure that all of these components of your application align, that the same things you have listed in your project timetable are also listed in a different form, of course, in your budget form, that the same things you're describing in your list of deliverables and your project description, that those are also mentioned again and reflected in that budget, in that timetable. And I think, printing out these parts of the application and looking at them visually to see that they are repeated in each different part of the application will help to make your project stronger. So, for example, if you talk about fabricating an exhibit as shown on the slide here, in your project description, and then there's no mention of how fabricating the exhibit will be paid for, or maybe you're using different terms that could be confusing for that in your timetable and budget, then the reviewers are going to have questions about, are you clear on all the steps that your project involves and how those steps will be paid for and when they'll take place. You want to make sure this is all very, very neat and tidy and clear. Another thing that can be very helpful for reviewers who are, of course, not as familiar with your project and with the property that you might be working with as you are, is to include some visuals. So show us maps. Submit with your application photographs, maybe showing the historic preservation work that needs to take place. Showing plans, for example, engineers or architectural drawings that you have, or conceptual plans. Any of those things to show us that you've done your homework, you're ready to do this project, are important. Visuals help. If something needs maintenance that you're proposing as part of your project, you should explain how that will be maintained. MHAA wants to fund projects that we know will be sustainable and they won't be going away, after the grant funding and match funding runs out. So we have some examples there. If you're going to be building a trail, think about who will be maintaining that trail in the future. And maybe list that somewhere in the application. If you're going to be proposing a website or a smartphone app, you'll want to describe in the place where it's asked in the application who will be paying the ongoing maintenance licensing fees for those applications. Of course, follow the directions in the online application forms. So please take the time to actually read those directions and make sure you're filling in all the required fields. Make sure you're saving and backing up your work as often as possible. So best practices, in my opinion, and best practices in general, not just my opinion, would be for you to answer the application questions in a Word document or Google Docs document, and some other document that you have saved elsewhere, and then copy and paste those answers into the application form as you go along. That way you have a copy of your answers saved elsewhere, and if for some reason you lose your work in the application, you can bring those answers right back in without having to rewrite them. And make sure you're saving often by changing pages or pressing save in the application. Even if you do nothing wrong and you have a freak power outage and your computer goes down, maybe you've written this long, beautiful answer, very concise, and you lose it all. If you had saved often enough, you'd only lose a small portion that hadn't been saved. So please keep that in mind. We also received some advice from reviewers that they'd like us to pass on to you as applicants. And some of those things are, first of all, think about partnerships and linkages that you can make as part of your project. So maybe you're doing a project on local African American history as an exhibit project, and there's another organization in your community who's been working with oral histories focusing on local African American history. If you all can link up, or maybe link up with the local school system who also has a similar focus in their history curriculum, all of those linkages will make your project stronger. And it's not just about getting a letter of support from a partnering organization, it's really thinking about how your project can be stronger because more organizations and individuals are involved. The letters of support are important. I'll throw that out there. And you'll see that as part of the application as well. We do ask for those letters. How will your project leverage additional state, federal, local government funding or private funding? So that's something you should describe as part of your application as well. Talk about how the money that MHAA is contributing will actually be bringing in other sources of funding as well that are coming together for your project. When you're developing your budget, you need to make it clear where the line item dollar amounts come from. What I mean by that is make it clear that you've done your research, that the cost you're proposing for a sprinkler system, for example, that you've gotten some quotes for that system, that you have looked at some comparable prices, and you can include that documentation, the research documentation that you've been building up as part of your application. There's a place for you to upload budget documentation. And please do not submit to us a budget with one line item. That's very important because we need to the reviewers, we need to understand how your budget is broken down into specific costs. For example, if a consultant gives you one cost, this is how much it's going to cost for me to create this interpretive plan for your site. You should ask the consultant, which is this a flat fee? If so, which items are covered? Can you list out which items of the interpretive plan that are distinct can be broken down into different line items? Or are you giving me an hourly rate? And if so, can you list how many hours? So those are just a couple examples, but you need to provide as much detail in the budget as possible. And ask yourself as well, what documentation you, the applicant, gather to submit to show that you have done your research. Perhaps it's estimates or comparable goods that you've priced online and seen some different prices for. More advice from reviewers. Make sure that you're answering the questions on the application. Don't just write what you think the reviewers want to hear. So don't just give us, the same elevator pitch for each question. If you're tempted to copy and paste a response to a previous question into a new question because you think really these questions are so similar, please ask us, what's the distinction you're making here? Because we want to make sure that that you understand how all of our questions should be different. If your project is primarily a planning or documentation project, so something like archaeology or oral history, or planning for the future of a site, then show us what the eventual heritage tourism product is going to be. You need to show that as part of your application. And you might assume that the reviewers will understand that because you're doing this archaeology survey, for example, that people will then be able to connect with the place where the archaeology is taking place eventually. Don't make that assumption that the reviewers will get that. You need to show them and make it clear that you're going to be putting in interpretive signs, that's down the road, that there will be tours that will be taking place here. So show us exactly why your project is a heritage tourism project. And then in turn, that will show us why it supports MHAA's overall program goals. We have some specific requirements for projects that take place on land owned by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, or Maryland DNR. So these projects, and you should start this as soon as possible, these projects must obtain approval for your proposed project prior to submitting your full application. That's the goal. So we have a specific form that you fill out and submit to DNR, and that's included as part of our fiscal year 2020 MHAA guidelines. It's on pages 24 and 25. So you submit that form by email to Shane Johnston at maryland.gov. He's with DNR, and allow for about a 30 to 45 day turnaround for the DNR review process. So we need to make sure that DNR is on board with your project before we can approve your grant application. And make sure you keep your email documentation showing that you submitted the form to DNR and that you gave them time to review it before the MHAA application deadline, because we will want to see that if it turns out you haven't heard back from them quite yet. If you can show us that you did at least submit the application to them or submit the form to them, that will be helpful for our process. And if you have any questions about that DNR process, please get in touch with us. So we've gone over a lot of items that you need to accomplish as part of your application process if you have decided that your project is a good fit for an MHAA grant. And because there are so many items you need to be thinking about, I wanted to try in this slide to help narrow down which action items you should prioritize first. So first of all, go ahead and submit your intent to apply form before January the 31st, 2019. That's a required step. That's very important. There's the link to our grants page where you can get to the link to start a new intent to apply form. And even if you don't have all the details for your project, you can go ahead and submit that very basic online form so we can give you feedback on the idea for the project. Next, you want to read the MHAA 2020 guidelines. that are on our website that I keep referencing, and use the checklist we've provided at the end of those guidelines. Add to that checklist as you read through the guidelines if you need to. Go ahead and start talking with your local heritage area staff. Talk with them about how your project aligns with their goals, and talk with them generally about, what your local heritage area does and how they can support you in this application process. Ask your legislators and your partners for letters of support now. So a lot of these people who you would love to get a letter of support from showing that they support your grant project are very busy. So if you give them more time to turn that around, the better. If you're doing a capital project or you're applying for a capital project, go ahead and obtain that property owner letter. So even if your organization owns the property, then you'll need to submit this letter. But if your organization doesn't own the property you're working with, where your project will take place, it's really important to go ahead and request that letter from the property owner so they've got time. An example of what that letter should look like is also included in the guidelines. If your project is located on Department of Natural Resources land, then you need to start that DNR approval process that I mentioned on the last slide as soon as possible. Go ahead and get approval from them that they support your project, so that, that we'll know that going forward. Start building your budget. The budget is what the reviewers look at first in many cases. So start getting estimates for specific line items. Start doing your homework to support your budget and to show you know exactly how much your project will cost. And keep in mind, you put that budget together, it's your best guess, but we do allow for changes later in the budget. So if a cost comes in differently, it's not going to be set in stone just because you said this was going to cost $200 at the application stage. There are opportunities down the road to adjust that as needed. Now, I want to show you, as the very last thing in the presentation, exactly how to get to that intent to apply form. What you need to do is go to the web address that we have listed here, and it's mht.maryland.gov/grants.html, and you can get to that also from going to the MHT homepage and clicking on Funding and Grants. Here's funding at the top. You could get to the same page here. But once you're on this page, this one right here, drawing a star, this is the right page, Grants at MHT, or Grants at Maryland Historical Trust. Once you're here, what you need to do is go down to the text here that says, to begin a new MHAA intent to apply form, and click here. That's where you'll start that intent to apply form. We also have tons of resources for applicants on this over on the side here, like the guidelines. So take a look at those. And once you get into the intent to apply form, you'll see some eligibility questions asking you if you are a nonprofit or a government agency, for example, making sure that the people who we have applying are indeed eligible, asking you which heritage area you're located in. Even if your project will be in multiple heritage areas, just choose one of them at the eligibility question stage. And once you get into the intent to apply, we have some very basic contact information at the top of the form, and then this is the information that you'll need to fill out. What's your project going to be? Describe your project, including what your end results and products will be, and the benefit to the heritage area. These are the only things you need to answer as part of the intent to apply, and they shouldn't be long answers, as you can see from the word count. And you'll need to select whether your project is going to be a capital or non-capital MHAA application. So let us know if you have any confusion about that. And you'll need to let us know how much you think you'll be requesting. If that changes later, that's okay. And you can tell us, do you anticipate that all of your match will be cash match, or perhaps that up to 25% of it will be in kind. So go ahead and fill out this part of the this part of the intent to apply But keep in mind that nothing that you put in the intent to apply is set in stone. You can change, the amount that you're requesting, for example, the project title. All of that you can change in the full application if needed. This is just to give us a basic idea of the project so we can give you that feedback. And we recommend that you do print a copy of your intent to apply for your records before you hit submit. After you complete your intent to apply, there's a couple next steps you should keep in mind just so you know what the process is. Again, you're going to get that feedback from your local heritage area. They hopefully will also be passing on feedback from Jen Ruffner and I at the state level. And so use that feedback as you complete your full application. And go ahead and do that by your local heritage area's deadline, which is going to be end of February into March. Make sure you know what that deadline is. If you do have documentation available for your matching contribution by June the 1st, make sure to submit that to myself or to Jen Ruffner before June the 1st by email. And you may not hear from us until July 11th or around that time when we have the decisional MHAA meeting. If your application was complete, we don't have any questions that come up from reviewers, then don't worry that you haven't heard from us. It just means your application was clear. We didn't need anything answered. But if we do reach out to you during the process of review, please try to get back to us as soon as possible so that we can get your answers to the reviewers who need them to score your grant application. So make sure that whichever email you used as the primary contact when you filled out your intent to apply form and your application form, and whatever email you used to set up your online account in our application system, that you're actually checking that email, that you're answering calls from the phone number you provided, and get back to us so that we can make sure to help, or make sure to get your answers to the reviewers, excuse me. And we do want to help, as I was saying, so if you have any questions, please reach out to us about anything that's been covered today or something that perhaps I've left out from today. Go ahead and email either Jen Ruffner or myself, Ennis Barbary Smith, and here's our information right there on the slide. You can also check out our website, which has all kinds of resources for applicants. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this webinar, and I hope it's been helpful for you.